Sit you on the platform. Well, good morning and welcome to Grace Chapel here in Sherman. We have been busy already this morning trying to get set up. Electronics have their own challenge by themselves, but we do welcome you here with us today. If you're on YouTube, things will appear, I guess, somewhat inverted. I'm not sure if that's the case. And if you're on the Facebook, somewhat the same situation. We haven't quite got that figured out, although we did think we had it figured out. So how that goes. But we're here and we celebrate today, Palm Sunday, with a message from Exodus chapter 16, verses 11 through 15. This is the sixth and final Sunday of the Lenten series. As I mentioned at the outset, the season of Lent encompasses all the weekdays between Ash Wednesday and Saturday before Easter. It does not count Sundays. Those are simply considered the Sundays of Lent. So this is the sixth and final Sunday of the Lenten series. In our series, which is entitled Sacrifice and Surrender at the Cross, we've aimed at guiding each of us in our sheltering in place order, but aimed at guiding each of us into the presence of God as well as the experience of God's grace as we make individual and collective preparation for Easter. In this series, we've been working through the acronym CROSS, cross, to learn what aspects of our lives come into play when we are literally at the cross. We began this series with a look into the choices a person must make when at the cross, and then we dove into the topic of relationships before focusing then on opportunities to be considered when at the cross. And then last week, we learned how God helps us with the situations we experience in life. And now, this morning, we discover God's solution for any and all challenges we might encounter. Some of you may recall the film produced. It's one of the classics, in fact, considered by many to be the number one movie ever made, and that is The Wizard of Oz, which is starred Judy Garland. The 1939 version saw Judy Garland, who played the character of Dorothy Gate, and her dog Toto being swept up in a tornado that hit Kansas and winding up in this, I'll just simply call this fantasy land. At some point in her presence in that place, she decided she wanted to go back home. And she was told that she went to see the Oz at Emerald City, that he would have the answer. And so she wound up, her along with her three friends, wound up going to see the Oz, and then he instructed her to get a particular item and then bring it back, and all of that she does in the course of this movie. When she arrives back, the Oz was going to transport her in a hot air balloon. And Judy Garland, or Dorothy Gate, wound up climbing in with her dog Toto, thinking that she was going to go back home, that this was the solution to her predicament, to her problem. And yet, at the last second, again, Toto jumped out of the basket, and Dorothy wound up following, and in the meantime, the balloon took off, and the Oz couldn't figure out how to bring the balloon back. Linda shows up and says to Dorothy, well, you've always had the power to return home where you desire to be, to go back to Auntie Em and the family and there in Kansas. And so she was instructed to tap 3 times the heel of the ruby slippers. And as she was doing that, she was quoting or saying, there's no place like home. And in the movie, it kind of projects that the reality of getting Dorothy back home was wrapped up in the having these red slippers and utilizing them. I wonder, though, in my own mind, if the power really wasn't in Judy's heart. The place that she really wanted to be in her heart was home, and as she began to audibilize this desire, there's no place like home, there's no place like home, there's no place like home, she was transported back to Kansas. Again, somewhat of a fictional story, but it highlights the importance of us being at the cross, and that at the cross is where we will find the solution for our lives. It's within us. And it's our desire to come to Christ, to come to God, to love Him, and to open ourselves up to the solution that He is going to offer. So there's two things that need to occur in order for you to be at the cross, to arrive at the cross. First of all, you must sacrifice your contrived answer. In Ecclesiastes chapter 7, it says, "Surely oppression destroys a wise man's reason." We've all felt the pressure or had the anxiety about trying to make a decision, a crucial decision. And we almost become overwhelmed. We don't want to make a mistake. We're not sure if our solutions are worthy, if they'll work. And so we kind of toss all of this back and forth in our minds, pressure to finally settle on some kind of a choice. That certainly was the case with the Israelites who were enslaved in Egypt. Before they could see God's solution to their dilemma, their bondage, their enslavement in Egypt, they had to sacrifice their contrived answer. We all are like that. We all formulate in our head what needs to happen and how we can get ourselves through any situation. Remember, though, this, that every sound and sensible solution that you suggest ultimately won't be satisfactory for you or pleasing to God. The second thing that needs to happen, besides sacrificing your contrived answer, you must surrender your conceptual approach. Now, the Israelites had developed this theory, which is the idea behind a conceptual approach, a theory that they felt would work for them. And their theory simply was that if they complained long enough and loud enough to God, that He would heed their pleas and help them out. In your notes, Exodus chapter 16, verses 11 and 12, you see that the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "I have heard the complaints of the children of Israel. Speak to them, saying, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God." So they had complained to God. That was their theory. That was their approach. They conceptualized that if they just were, again, loud enough before God and bargained with Him and shared with Him, that He would ultimately cave into their desires. In Numbers chapter 11, it says, "Now the people complained about their hardships in the hearing of the Lord, and then when He heard them, His anger was aroused." To see God's solution for you, you'll need to surrender your conceptual approach. In the fall of my 7th grade school year, I was staying at my grandmother's house. Actually, it was a duplex. She lived on the south side of the duplex, and my aunt, her sister, lived on the east side. Well, my folks had gone to attend a college football game, and they had left me on this incredibly gorgeous day to stay with my grandmother. I called her Granny. And so I, as I often did, gathered and organized a group of guys, and we decided we would play a pickup game of sandlot football. Now, my grandmother's duplex in the back side, which would be the western side of her duplex, had about a 25 to 35 foot flat area. There were some trees. It was an area large enough for some cars to park, or if you needed to turn around, you could do so at the back of the duplex. But beyond that, there was a short sloping hill, and it smoothed out into what my brother has told me was a well-used croquet court. It was good size, but it was perfect for our pickup sandlot football game. So we had five guys. One was a full-time quarterback. We switched out after each game, but there was one full-time quarterback and two on each side. And the idea was that you would always start at the edge where that little short hill came flattened out. You always would start there, and you had 4 downs to score a touchdown. All the boundaries were set up, and we had the goal line established, and so we had 4 tries to get to into that end zone. Well, we were playing, and we had a set limit. It was probably like the first 1 to 3 or the first 1 to 5 touchdowns. But our team was thinking all we needed to do was stop them on downs, and we would win on this particular round of games. And so my teammate was guarding the center, the person who hiked the ball, and I was on one of the other boys. And so when he hiked the ball, he took off and he stopped, and the quarterback threw a short pass, thinking that this individual could make a move, get around my teammate, and make a fast dash into the end zone. Well, he made his move, and sure enough, got around my teammate. And as he's heading towards the end zone, I had put a straight line V toward him, and I was running at full speed, trying to intercept him right before he would cross the goal line. And I have to admit, I did just that. I dove and got a hold of his bottom of his leg, his foot, and he tripped and he fell, and I jumped up with elation because we had won this round of our Sandlot football game. Well, as I jumped up, I realized that there was something wet trickling down my left leg. I thought at first it was perspiration because it was a warm fall day. I thought it was perspiration, but as I looked down, I realized that my jeans had been torn. And as I opened up the tear right below my knee, I could see that I had been injured. And so I began to hobble back towards the duplex, towards the place on the side where my grandmother lived. And she had apparently been watching out the back window and made her way down, and she was coming toward me. And as I got to the edge of the house, I could just barely walk anymore. And as she came and she looked, I looked down, and I could see that my bottom part of my jeans were saturated with red. My shoe was filled, and I knew I'd been hurt, extremely hurt. And so she took me into her duplex, and she called for her sister, and Edna came over. And we began to work through some of the options. And one of the options they said is, well, let's go to the doctor and let him look at it. Well, it hadn't been all that long that I had gone to a doctor, and he had stitched a place above my eye. He was Dr. Helsher. We used to call him an Army doctor or a Force doctor, but we called him an Army doctor because he was, let's get it done and get it over with. And so without ever deadening it, he just put in 3 stitches on my eye. And I was thinking about that and realizing, I probably need some stitches, but I don't want to go to him. And so Edna came up with a solution. She discussed it openly, and they decided that, well, they could clean the wound, around the wound. They had a disinfectant that they could pour into the wound, and then they had a powder, some kind of a disinfectant powder. Hindsight, it looked something like talcum powder, and they would pour that in there, which they did, and then we would wrap it real tight with gauze, and then, with a day or two's rest, it should be fine. And so that was the solution that I had decided upon. It seemed reasonable, it seemed viable, but here's the fallacy of that type or that line of thinking. My contrived solution wasn't the right solution. Now, last week, we were looking at how God helps us with our situations, and I shared that Christ is always the correct solution with the perfect or right answer. And that is absolutely and unequivocally true. Yet people still resist God's solution. Why is that? Well, one of the reasons that they resist is because they look and think that the cost is too much. At least in their minds, they believe the cost is too great. Another reason is that they are critical towards God. They just don't trust Him. They haven't had maybe a good experience, but they don't trust Him. Another reason is that they're unwilling to change. And people will hesitate to change unless they have enough information or if they heard enough. But they will resist the solution that God gives to them. They will resist also because what is required of them isn't convenient. And hey, in America, we're all about convenience. We all want the easy route out. We don't want to be interrupted. And so they resist that solution. Or they realize that the acceptance of God's solution is confessing their inability. And whoever wants to admit that their solution just isn't a solution? We all think that with a little bit of manipulation, any suggestion we offer ought to work. And then lastly, people will resist God's solution because it doesn't fit their criteria. They have an idea of what they want to have happen. They've set the parameters that they expect God to work within. But God never will be held into that box you've created. He's far greater. In fact, the Scripture tells us that He can do exceeding abundantly beyond all that we think and hope. And so beyond means that the parameters of this box that we want God to work within doesn't really contain Him at all. So in our Scripture, we saw that the people had asked for help. And the Lord responded by saying to Moses, I'm going to meet their need. We've seen that in verse 11, and then we saw it in verse 12. The passage in your notes carries forward in verse 13 and says, so it was that quails came up at evening and covered the camp, and in the morning the dew lay around the camp. And when the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a small round substance as fine as frost on the ground. Now, if you read further on your own into verses 17 and 20, you know that, again, the Israelites, even though God was offering a solution, kind of took things into their own hands. Moses had instructed them not to take more than what they need, that their needs each and every day would be met. Bread in the morning, meat in the evening. But what we find is that they decided, some of them decided that they would hold on, that they would take not only enough for today, but enough for tomorrow. Now you remember when Jesus was teaching His disciples how to pray, He said, ask God to give you today your daily bread. It's a tie back into this particular passage and to this particular situation. But some of these Israelites were not obeying. They were not trusting God for each and every day. And so they held on to more than what they needed. And when the next morning came, they found that what they had held on to, well, we used to say it stunk. It was stinking, and it was full of worms. In other words, it was no longer a viable solution for them. We find then that in verse 15, so when the children of Israel saw it, they said to one another, what is it? And I think many times that's what happens when we ask God to give us solution. He gives us or provides us with that solution, and we kind of scratch our heads and say, well, what's this? Because we're not sure. It doesn't fit our mold. It doesn't fit our thinking. But again, if we will sacrifice our contrived answer and surrender our conceptual approach, and we come to the cross, at the cross we will find the solution God has for us. It's waiting there for you to come to the cross. And so this morning we want to find and discover how is it that we can come to the cross? How can we arrive at the cross where God's solution is waiting for us? Well, first of all, you have to admit your shortcomings and need for help. I know this is one of the hardest things for us to do, is to admit that we don't have all of the answers, that we don't have all of the capability, that we're kind of stumped, that we have to really rely on God. But that's the first step in you getting to the cross. Arriving at the cross, we're waiting for you, is the solution that God has for your problem. In the Old Testament, the prophet Hosea records these words. God says, "Then I will return to my place until they admit their guilt and look to me for help." So God is echoing what I just said in the Old Testament. It's not a new concept. It's been going on for years and years, where we take matters into our own hands. We think we know what's best. But God says, I have the solution. Admit that you don't. Come to me, and I will allow you to take that solution and apply it to your life. In Psalm, so we arrive at the cross. Now, there's two things, again, that we talked about that you have to do to accomplish this admission. Sacrificing your contrived answer and surrendering your theoretical and conceptual approach. The old theory of cause and effect really doesn't pan out. And if you do this, then what I should expect is that what I feel or think in my head is effective. In reality, in practical and spiritual terms, it doesn't work. In Job chapter 5, verse 8, one of Job's friends said to him when they were discussing his situation, "Job, if I were you, I'd ask God for help." That's good advice. What that means is you have to admit that you need God's help. To arrive at the cross, secondly, you need to approach God with humility and honesty. You need to approach God with humility and honesty. Daniel was one of those incredible prophets of the Old Testament. When Nebuchadnezzar was having difficulty interpreting a dream, he was called upon, Daniel was called upon, and ultimately said, I can interpret that only if God gives me the answer. And so he did, and he was heralded by Nebuchadnezzar, given a title. You hand forward from Daniel chapter 2 into Daniel chapter 10, and you find that Darius was now over the kingdom, the Babylonian kingdom, and he is approaching Daniel in the same way. This is what the Old Testament in Daniel, it says, God, the angel of God, was saying, Daniel, don't be afraid. God has listened to your prayers since the day you humbly asked for understanding. There's a real key there. We need to humbly and honestly approach God. In Matthew 6:6, Jesus says, here's what I want you to do. Find a quiet, secluded place so you won't be tempted to role play before God. Just be there as simply and honestly as you can manage. The focus will shift from you to God, and you will begin to sense His grace. When you're at the cross, you've admitted your shortcomings as well as your need for help. And when you approach the cross with humility and honesty, what you ultimately find is God's grace, His solution at the cross. Thirdly, when you arrive at the cross, you need to ask God specifically for His solution and then obediently apply it. You need to specifically ask God for His solution and obediently apply it. In Psalm 102, verse 1, it is referred to as a prayer and a plea of an afflicted man when he was faint. And he's there at what we would call the cross, that he's before God and he's lamenting over his predicament. The advice was, hear my prayer, Lord. Let my cry for help come to you. His ask, not his advice, but his asking was, I'm here. Now, please, please, I beg of you, please give me the solution. When David was speaking to his son Solomon, he said to Solomon, my son, know that God, your father, my father, the God of your father, and serve him with a loyal heart, with a willing mind, for the Lord searches all hearts and understands all the intent of your thoughts. In other words, when you come to the cross and you're asking of God, he looks into your heart and he knows. He knows if you're actually being sincere, and certainly if you are being selfish in what you are asking. That's not the ask, that's not the prayer that God's going to respond to. Again, you need to come with humility and honesty. You need to ask him specifically for his solution, and then be willing to obey and apply that into your life. The key then comes in the next part of arriving at the cross. It's asking God. It is you need to accept God's loving, gracious, and merciful solution. Now, I say this with love and affection. Don't be a big baby. What I would say is don't be a big baby. Don't be like the Israelites who whined and cried and manipulated and pleaded. Don't be a big baby, but be a big believer that God is able and willing to provide for you. In 1941, there was a Superman episode, and in that episode, Clark Kent, when hearing of a problem, said, and this was the quote, that sounds like a job for Superman. Now, I wasn't alive in 1941, but in some of the old shows that I've seen that phrase or heard that phrase. So when you're considering your situation, when you're considering your problem, and you're attempting to calculate and negotiate a solution, remember that your problem sounds like a job for God. Now, you can trust in God's solution because, first of all, he has a proven track record. You can trust in God's solution because he has a proven track record. In your notes, you see the verse Exodus 18:8, which says, Moses told his father-in-law about everything the Lord had done to rescue Israel from Pharaoh and the Egyptians. He also told him about the problems they had faced along the way and how the Lord had delivered his people from all their troubles. Now you'll notice that the word Lord in both places is capitalized, and that's meaningful because that tells us that Moses was looking at God as a covenant God. A covenant God that has established a covenant with those who come to him and accept Christ as their Lord and Savior. The covenant says, I will care for you and I will solve your problem if you meet this condition. So once we meet the condition of obeying and serving and loving God with all of our heart, soul, and mind, God's promise, the covenant is that he will take care of us. So what we find is that you can trust in God's solution because he's a proven track record. You look through history, look through the Old Testament, look to the testimonies of people who are around you, and they're testifying of what God has done for them, not only in the past, but even in the present. Secondly, you can trust in God's solution because he is a present help and protection for your time of need. Now, there's times when I found myself into a bind and I had wished that somebody I knew was there with me who can help me or at least listen to me. The reality is that there's always times when we wish somebody else was there with us. But with truth, we need to understand is that God is always there. He's always present with us. Now, you may not recognize that, but it doesn't deny or doesn't negate the fact that God is always with us. That's what he said to Moses. I will not fail or forsake you. He told the same thing to Joshua when he assumed the leadership of the nation. And when Joshua was passing on his mantle of leadership, he reminded the whole nation that God will not fail or forsake you. I'm reminding you today that he is a present help and protection in your time of need. In Psalm 62:8, people trust God all the time. Tell him all your problems because God is our protection. And then this little word that is so powerful, it's a musical term, Selah, which means pause, take a breath, let it digest, bring that peace into your life and into your heart. God can protect you and he will provide you with a solution to your problems. You can trust God thirdly because he genuinely cares and problem solves for his people. He genuinely cares and problem solves for his people. In Matthew 9:36, we find this recorded when he, referring to Jesus, saw the crowd. He felt sorry for them. They were confused and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Well, your shepherd, the good shepherd, is Jesus Christ. And so when he looks upon you and your situation, his heart breaks. And because he genuinely cares and loves you, he provides you willingly with a solution. It's a matter of you at the cross accepting his solution, his loving, gracious, and merciful solution. And if you do that, you will have the solution that you need. Now in Colossians chapter 2, verse 6, these aren't in your notes, but in Colossians chapter 2, verse 6, it says, and now just as you trusted Christ to save you, trust him too for each day's problem. Live in vital union with him. Now the key I want you to look at is what Paul is writing to the church in Colossae. And he says, now, just as you have trusted Christ to save you, the biggest problem you will ever encounter is your sin problem. Really, I know it sounds almost overwhelming, but the other problems pale in comparison to your problem in regards to sin. And Paul is simply saying, if you have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, you've accepted him as your Lord and Savior, then you've overcome the biggest problem that you will ever face. And the same God who helped with a solution to that problem will take your everyday current problem and offer you a solution as well. Christ is the problem solver for the sin in your life. In 1 John chapter 2, verse 2, it says, when he served as a sacrifice for our sins, he solved the sin problem for good. Not only ours, but the whole world. So if God has actually solved the sin problem for you and for me, then he's offered us that solution when we arrive at the cross. And knowing then that that has been solved, that sin problem has been solved in our lives, then it gives us confidence to trust him with the other issues, the other problems, the other challenges, the other predicaments we're going to face on an everyday basis. Well, I lay there on the couch and thought to myself that everything was going to be all right. Little did I know. Later that afternoon, Bob Murphy, who was the son-in-law of my Aunt Edna, he came by to visit her, and apparently she told him what had happened. And he made his way over to Granny's side of the duplex. And when he came in, my leg had already begun to stiffen up, and so he asked if he could take a look. And so there on the couch, he began to unravel that gauze bandage that was on top. And with each unwrapping layer, you could begin to pick up the stench that was coming from this infected wound. He looked in amazement and he said, man, you need to go to the doctor. And so he rushed me down to Dr. Ironman's house, which also served as his office. And after several hours of flushing out the infection, cleaning up the wound, injecting me with antibiotics and suturing both inside and out of the cut, he was done. And as he would say to me, you had no time to spare. He had saved my leg. That's why you need God. We take it to the nth degree. We take it to the edge of the cliff, needlessly. Because ultimately, God is the answer. And the solution is right there, waiting for you on the cross. Oh, pride will get in the way. Sometimes even fear will get in the way. But you can trust God. You can believe in Him. And if you get and arrive at the cross, that solution is there and it's available to you. Now, several things are going to happen when you arrive at the cross. Because God's solution is waiting there for you. First of all, your load will be lightened. Secondly, your spirit will be lifted. And lastly, your life will be warmed by God's love. Now, you can imagine that. I mean, does it really get any better? It's not like, I made it through that. When you come to cross, God has a solution waiting for you. Whether it's a sin problem or an earthly problem, whether it's a relational problem, whether it's a business problem, no matter what the problem, He's got a solution for you. And when you accept His solution and apply it to your life, these three things are going to happen. You're going to feel that load lighten. I mean, instantaneously. When you accept Christ and His solution, that load is lifted. Your spirit will be lifted. Your load lightened, your spirit lifted, and your life will have this warmth. We call it the peace that goes beyond understanding, and the cause of that is the warmth of God's love in your life. At the cross, that's where your solution is waiting. Understand that people who do what is right, as is recorded in Psalm 34, verse 19, people who do what is right may have many problems, but the Lord will solve them all. Just because you're a good person doesn't mean you're not going to have problems or challenges. It's not a bad person versus good person, it's just life. That's the way life is. God understands. We have a high priest out of Hebrews, a high priest that understands every problem that we encounter because he faced the same problem. And so he knows how to offer a worthwhile and workable solution for your life. The question is, will you come to him at the cross? This is Palm Sunday. Today that Jesus entered into Jerusalem and everybody was there for the Passover. All the good Jews made their way to the city of Jerusalem to celebrate this festival, this feast of unleavened bread and the Passover. They had a concept of what Jesus would be, what the Messiah would be. And because they had that conception or that theory that he would come on a mighty horse and raise the army of Israel and go against the Roman Empire and reestablish Israel as the predominant power in the world. That was their concept. But as Jesus entered into Jerusalem, the Messiah that they were supposedly supposed to be awaiting, when he entered in, he was riding on a donkey. And they threw palms and laid their cloaks down on the path, and they yelled out, "Hosanna, Hosanna." They really thought that he was that Messiah. He was the Messiah, but conceptually they didn't understand. I want you again to hear what I'm saying. There is no other answer other than Christ, who has the solution that you need in your life right now. No matter what the problem, no matter who you are, has the solution. Find a secluded spot. Quiet yourself. Take a deep breath. And Open your mind and your heart to Him. He will give you that solution. That's my hope. That's my prayer for each of you today. There's a passage in Numbers chapter 6 that I want to use to close out this morning. It was given to Moses by the Lord, and then he was instructed to give it to Aaron. And Aaron was then to use this prayer in order to bless the Israelites. And so Aaron was to pray this prayer, and I want to pray this prayer over you today. The prayer was, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make His face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn His face toward you and give you peace. That's my hope. The peace of God flood your heart, your soul, and your mind today as you go to the cross and accept His solution.